Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Arcserve webinar. My name is Charlie Smith. I'm a Senior Principal Consultant in the UK and Ireland, and I'm going to talk to you about tape technology in general. As the title of the presentation says, tape is not dead. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of customers who are implementing new data protection solutions today tend to base that backup technology on disk. And also a lot of customers are looking to reduce tape because we all know that tape management can be a real pain. It can be a real resource drainer as well in terms of IT staff and productivity. And I think the main reason for that is traditionally most customers have backed up directly to tape in the past, and they're looking for something that is more automated, less user involvement, to free up IT resources. But I think if tape is used in the correct way or in a new way, tape technology still adds significant value, especially if you're one of these organizations that need to keep and retain certain backups for a very long periods of time. Typically, when we speak to NHS, local governments, universities, etc., often they have to keep data for 10 years, 15, 20 years, 30 years, plus it depends on the type of data that it is. And when you think about that, having a strategy that involves tape or uses tape can make a lot of sense. So it's really about how you use tape technology. So what I'm going to do is just go through the agenda. We're going to talk about market statistics, about how the backup market is changing and what percentage of customers use disk, what use tape, etc. So it's quite an interesting read. We're also going to talk about tape versus disk, what's the pros and the cons of looking at and using both technologies. We're going to specifically talk about the LTO, linear tape open format. Predominantly, there are other, obviously, tape vendors on the market, IBM, Storage Tech, etc., that have different proprietary tape formats. But I think it's fair to say the vast majority of mid-enterprise customers would use LTO tape technology now. It's pretty commonplace across the industry. And I'll talk about the LTO roadmap as well, which is quite exciting in terms of performance and capacity over the next 3 or 4 generations of LTO that's going to be coming out. Going to be talking about tape best practice, also using things like disk-to-disk tape in your backup strategy is also quite interesting. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So before we kind of dive into the specifics, I just want to kind of spend a little bit of time showing you a video now about what Google actually use. Google obviously have cloud data centers all over the world, using all the latest generation disk technology, internet connectivity, WAN replication, etc. But even in Google's data center, you'll see that tape is still a fundamental key part of their strategy. So I'm just going to play this.
Whenever you use a Google product, you're connecting to one of our data centers around the world. Let's take a look inside and see how they work. Google employees work here, keeping the data center up and running 24 hours a day. The networking room is the first stop on our data center floor. The equipment here routes requests to the right servers in the next room. These computers also allow our data centers to communicate with one another globally. On the server floor, powerful computers handle everything from billions of searches to hosting YouTube videos and protecting your email against viruses. We've custom designed these servers to be compact and energy efficient. To ensure you have access to your data whenever you need it, we keep each piece of data stored on at least 2 servers. We store another copy of the most important data on digital tapes. When a hard drive breaks, we erase all of its content. Then, for extra security, we destroy it with our disk crusher. The machines in our data centers are always working. Cooling towers like these pipe in water to cool them down and keep them running. When the water heats up, we pump it back outside where it evaporates. Now that you've had a glimpse, walk inside yourself. Explore a Google data center with Street View.
Okay, the reason why I showed you that is that about 4 or 5 years ago now, Google's Gmail service had a major outage, and their outage was caused by a software bug which affected Google Mail, but also Google apps that integrate with Google Mail, like Google Calendar and other things as well. And the Google engineers had to restore user mailboxes from offline tape, because what they found is that the Google Mail stores got corrupted, and obviously those corruptions were backed up and replicated to their DR second copy of the data. So in effect, they had 2 backups of the data that were useless. And in the end, they basically had to restore off tape, because Google do disk to disk and obviously replicate that disk, but then they offload their most important data off to digital tape. And if it wasn't for the fact that they had a tape backup, which was completely offline and disconnected, they would have not been able to restore most of their users' mailboxes. And that's well documented. There is a link at the bottom of this page that explains exactly what happened. So, the point is that even in today's modern world, where we're all digitally connected, where everybody's talking about cloud connectivity for DR and disk-to-disk backups, tape still provides the belt and braces, the last line of defense, that if everything else goes wrong, it's a medium that can be depended on to restore critical data. So I think for the foreseeable future, Google will always use tape, and they will remind themselves of how critical tape was in that restore process when their Gmail service failed. So if it's good enough for Google, I think it's fair to say it's probably good enough for most of us. Now I'm just going to look at backup storage market statistics. These are a few years old now, and you'd probably argue, that if you look at 15 and 16 figures, which will be published next year, that tape technology will have shrunk even more. So if you look at the calendar year 13, 54% of backups were directly backed up to tape. And you can see that in 2014, that had reduced to 40%. So in 2014, it was the first time that disk-based backups actually overtook tape-based backups. And to me, that makes a complete 100% amount of sense, because when we'll talk about disk versus tape, you'll see that there are some drawbacks using tape, especially if you're using tape all the time as your first point of backup. So it doesn't surprise me, and I would probably go as far to saying now that if you look at external cloud, there it's a very small percentage. I think you'll find that cloud is also growing significantly, and appliances as well. So it'll be interesting to see the next statistics. But the point is it's a general trend that disk-based backups are becoming the norm. And I think it's fair to say, even when we look at our own backup technology, very efficient disk-based backup does make a lot of sense, and we'll talk more about that. However, when you compare the technologies like for like, and I suppose at this point I am talking tape down a little bit, but tape is less reliable than disk. There's lots of complex moving parts. Ultimately a tape is just full of literally tape, that's reeled, and there's hundreds and hundreds of meters of tape that gets wound and rewound inside a cartridge. So if you think about it logically, it's no great surprise that there's a lot of things that could potentially go wrong with tape. So it's susceptible to dust contamination, from air conditioning in data centers, where dust can get onto the tape, and that can cause it to be very unreliable at times. Having said that, we'll talk about how tape is becoming more resilient going forward. Lots of wear and tear in the typical tape-based backup environment. If you're reutilizing tapes where they get written to, they're retained for a few weeks, and then they go back into the scratch set and they're written to again, there's also a chance that if you don't manage your tapes efficiently, i.e. know when they become end of life and they should be destroyed, that there's a risk that the tape can become unreliable. I remember the days going back into the 90s and the early millennium when we used to use 4mm DAT tapes, you know, to back up Solaris systems and Windows systems. And at the time, you know, 4mm DAT tapes were state of the art. But I remember also the horrors of trying to recover critical data from these 4mm digital tapes and being let down where halfway through recovering a session, you know, you'd get a read error, and that was it. There was nothing you could do. You couldn't, you know, you would try again just to see if it was a one-off, and it failed again, and that was it. You know, that data wasn't able to be recovered from that recovery point. You maybe had to go back to an older recovery point to restore the data. So tape can be problematic. And also the access time. I think it's fair to say that with disk, everything is online, so you just need to invoke either a full system restore of a physical or a virtual machine, or a granular restore of files, folders, or application or email, etc. Having the data on disk makes a lot of sense because you can initiate that process straight away. There's no time, you know, taken up waiting for media to be brought back on site if it's been shipped off site to BR, which is often the main reason why these tape-based restores are delayed, because you're having to wait for the media to be brought back on site. But also, when you're actually doing restores themselves, if you're doing lots of sort of incremental backups, the actual time it takes to recover the full, and then you've got to apply all the incremental media on top of that, also causes a delay in the recovery time as well. And obviously when you're doing it from disk, it kind of does it much faster, so you don't really notice the fact that you're restoring X number of incrementals on top of a full base image. And also tape mobility increases security risks. I think, you know, not in the last year or so, but going back 3 or 4 years ago, there was a lot of articles in the media about tapes being, you know, taken or stolen, and data wasn't encrypted, so data could be read off the tapes by criminal organizations or whatever. And because we didn't widely use tape encryption at the time, you know, it was a risk sending in sensitive information on a tape off-site, because if it got into the wrong hands, that could compromise your business, etc. So there are obviously lessons being learned from that as well. So when you look at disk and tape, you know, I think it's fair to say your first point of backup should be disk, and for all the obvious reasons that I just explained there before. However, when we look at the tape technology now, certainly I think from about LTO4 upwards, I think most customers would argue that tape has become a lot more reliable than it used to be. As long as you clean your tape units and your tape drive regularly, and you understand the life cycle of your tapes and replace them when they need to be replaced, I think tape can actually be very, very reliable. Now, when we look at the LTO format, it's pretty much proven to be the most popular format, popular standard. It was a bit like in the olden days when people had video cassettes, and it was between Betamax and VHS kind of won the day. It's a bit like that with LTO. LTO is pretty much the industry standard in many ways. I do acknowledge, however, there are other tape formats available, so I'm not dismissing IBM. They had 3594 and other tape formats that they introduced in recent years, which is very popular in enterprise organizations. But I think in the mid and enterprise and SMB, LTO is pretty much seen as the industry standard. LTO6 supports up to 2.5 terabytes of data uncompressed. So essentially you can get between 5.5 and 6.5 terabytes of compressed data on an LTO6 cartridge, with speeds up to about 400 megabytes per second. And, you know, assuming 2-to-1 compression, it still offers a lot of capacity. You know, over 6 terabytes of storage on a single cassette is pretty good. Now we've got LTO7, and I'll talk a bit more about that. LTO7 kind of doubles both the capacity and read performance as well, transfer performance. So with LTO7 now, you can get between 12 and 14 terabytes of data on a cartridge, depending on what compression you get. And the read transfer speeds have kind of almost doubled as well. And LTO8 is planned in late 2017. And again, that's going to boost the new raw cartridge capacity to 12.8 terabytes, which is pretty much 25 terabytes plus of compressed data. So you can see a trend here that every addition or iteration of LTO that's coming out is pretty much doubling in capacity and almost doubling in performance transfer speeds. And then obviously LTO10 is going to have, you know, nearly 100 terabytes of compressed data on a cartridge, and the writes and transfer speeds are going to be significantly faster again. So people say tape is dead. It really isn't. It's just that the way we use tape is dead, if that makes sense. So, you know, backing up directly to tape is dead, but if you use tape in the right way, it could be make a lot of sense. And I'm actually going to talk through some use cases of very large organizations that actually use tape almost as a file system to access their critical data, because they have so much information. Keeping it on disk is not really sustainable. The amount of storage they would need to hold the amount of these supercomputer data, it wouldn't make any sense. Now, in terms of the roadmap, I've kind of touched on it a little bit, but you can see there that, you know, Generation 7 is already on the market today. So you can get about 16 terabytes of data compressed on a cartridge, and about nearly 800 megabytes per second streaming speed. And you can see it going up the food chain, as it were. So I think, you know, tape's going to be around for a long, long time. It's just how we use tape will change significantly. So there is a file system format called LTFS, which is Linear Tape File System. And the LTFS file system is an open industry standard. It's not widely used by businesses today, but it does have a specific role to allow tape to be used as a sort of network attached file system. It's like a NAS storage system, but instead of that NAS being hosted by disk, it's hosted by tape technology. So the NERSC, which is the National Energy Research Scientific Computer Center in the US, hosts these what we call supercomputers that gather, you know, lots of information, and they've got about 20 to 40 terabytes of data they collect every day, and the system itself is hosting over 20 petabytes, and it's growing at 40 terabytes a day, which is mind-boggling. And they've said that their active archive has a reread rate of which about 30% is active. So that means that they're accessing 30% of this data all the time from tape. They're reading it in and out of the system, doing historical compares with current data and all sorts of clever things. So they're constantly accessing a third of that archive on a regular basis. And he's basically said with tape, you might lose 1 or 2 files out of many petabytes, whereas on disk, you lose everything if there's a problem with the disk system, which is fine. But again, like all technologies, it's how you design the solution to make it resilient, etc. So I know for a fact, like for example, Aardman Studios, who make Wallace and Gromit, you know, and lots of Hollywood film companies, they back up all their digital data directly to tape, and they use tape to access information on a regular basis. And the reason for it is that they just have so much data, it's not sustainable to put it on disk. The cost of hosting those disks would just become frighteningly expensive. And that really leads nicely onto the cost of disk versus tape as well. Typically now you can buy an LTO5, even an LTO6 cartridge for about £20 or less, depending on where you shop around. I know a lot of large organizations we deal with, obviously because they're buying hundreds of tapes every year, not thousands, they get a very competitive price on that. And when I did research a few months ago, you could pick up a single LTO drive, an LTO5 or an LTO6 unit now, so between £1,500 and £2,000 or less, depending on what make or type that you go for. So I did some calculations. So if you took 10 terabytes of data, that equals about 15 pence per gigabyte to hold that information on tape, and that includes the cost of the drive unit itself into that calculation. Whereas if you look at 10 terabytes of branded direct nearline SAS or SATA storage, you'd be expected to pay about £3,500, equals to about 34 pence per gigabyte. So you can see, that tape is a lot cheaper to hold per gigabyte than disk. Even though the cost of disk is significantly falling, often when you buy these tape units or direct attached disk storage arrays, the cost of the actual disk is cheap, but it's the actual management and the RAID controllers and all the management layer in these disk arrays which still are very expensive. So depending on what your business is and how long you need to retain data, tape still offers a very good cost per gigabyte to retain and store data for long periods of time. And also, tape can be the high performance storage alternative, where if you're, this is an organization in the US, National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois in Chicago, is one of the fastest computers in the world. And it's used to predict hurricanes and weather in very complex weather patterns and satellite imagery. They can predict the movement of hurricanes and weather patterns and typhoons, etc., around the world. And they use tape to store over 380 petabytes of nearline data. When I say nearline, that means data that's accessed on a regular basis, a bit like storage on disk. They don't use tape for archive. It's used as a fundamental data feeder to this supercomputer. And superior for sequential processing applications. It's fair to say that if you're reading very large chunks of data, off a media, tape provides very fast sequential access times to large chunks of data. And combined with all the tape drives that they use, they get a combined read-write throughput of 61 gigabytes a second, which is phenomenally fast. So tape is superior for straight line speed, but the challenge is often with tape is getting these LTO units to stream. Often in a backup architecture, customers say, I've got an LTO6 drive or an LTO7, and I'm getting a fraction of the throughput what the drive is capable of supporting. And the reason for that is often that they're not pumping the data across the network from their various nodes that they're backing up fast enough. So really you then rely on technology that does multiplexing or interleaving, depending on what vendor you deal with, which allows you to read multiple streams at the same time and merge it together so you get a faster throughput going to the tape. You also need a fast computer system, a server hosting that tape library unit as well, that gives you the right RAID or SAS connection into the tape unit, so you get the performance and the block size and the buffers that you need to read that data in. So you need a very powerful backup server and a well-configured source drive array to multiplex the data. So to get the read speed, it is possible, but you need intelligence in the backup technology to be able to provide that aggregated throughput to keep them drive streaming. And also mobility, that's another great thing about tape, is that once you've written to the tape and you've ejected it from your tape library unit, that data is pretty much protected as long as you look after it. So we can ship a box of tape cartridges from your production location to any off-site facility for long-term storage. It's a very simple, basic DR strategy, but it's very effective because once those tapes have been removed from your site, you've got a very resilient copy of the data that even if the building and all your data centers were blown up and something catastrophic happened, you can get that information back from the tapes, which is very reliable. And also, you know, we talk about high-speed internet connections, and it's fair to say that a lot of customers now can get accessible, fairly high-speed, wide area network connectivity or cloud connectivity over the internet at a fairly affordable, low cost. You know, 5 years ago, to put a 100 megabit pipe, which was a 100 megabit upload and download, was hugely expensive, you know, and putting lines faster than 100 megabit was just unheard of unless you were, you know, Sky Television or, you know, the Royal Bank of Scotland or, you know, Tesco's supermarkets. But outside of very large enterprises, you know, the cost of putting gigabit links and things like that was just unheard of. But even today, a lot of smaller businesses struggle where they have lots of remote sites and branch offices and they've got really small links, and it's not really achievable, even though it would be nice to automate everything and replicate data across links to central repositories. For some customers, it just isn't possible. So tape does offer a good practical alternative to WAN replication. Okay, now what I want to talk about is disk to tape, because yes, that's not a new process. That's been going on for many years, but it's evolving all the time. You know, I remember speaking to customers, even now, going back over the last 2 or 3 years, and most customers that did disk to tape would have a big sort of dump area, a disk-based backup repository, and their backups would be staged to that disk. But then within 24 hours, it was migrated to tape, and the disk staging area was cleared down as quickly as possible because they didn't have the capacity to hold more than maybe 1 or 2 recovery points on disk before the disk ran out of space. So disk was really just an initial collection point to give you that throughput across all your different nodes to collect the data into one location. And then when you did the disk to tape copy, you got fairly fast disk to tape performance because you were basically migrating from a local disk straight to a tape unit, normally on the same backup server. So you didn't get the delays in pulling data clients across the network, and you could keep tape drives streaming. So it kind of made a lot of sense. But now with this technology and data deduplication, it's kind of evolved again, because disk to disk now gives you that ability to hold days, weeks, and months of recovery points on disk. Whereas a couple of years ago, unless you were going out buying a data domain device, which is going to cost you a 6-figure sum, or a dedupe hardware appliance, most customers were just using maybe compression on disk or, you know, through their backup software, but they didn't tend to have deduped disk staging areas. It was just a very short-term dumping ground for their backups before they were staged off to tape. But now if you review that disk to tape process, because we can retain disk-based backups now for significantly longer periods of time, I'm talking months, if not years, the frequency that you need to do the tape can drop significantly. You know, so we've got customers now that may only migrate monthly or quarterly recovery points off to tape, and those tapes are used purely for long-term archive. All their daily, weekly, and monthly recovery points are on disk. They can also replicate those disks off-site to have 2 copies on disk. So you're never actually going to restore from tape for standard restore processes. Tape is only there that if you need to go back 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, or longer, that you've got a copy on tape which has got a historical recovery point going back maybe 5, 10 years, depending on what your retention policy is. So by using new generation disk with data deduplication and tape, you suddenly find that the tape management element drops significantly. And no longer is it a daily, weekly chore that kills your IT department. If you're only having to load tapes into an autoloader or a tape library unit once a month, that is a process that you can probably manage quite comfortably. and all your daily and weekly backups are done to disk and then replicated off-site for DR resilience. So it gives you the best of both worlds. You get the speed and flexibility of disk when responding to applications with demanding RPO and RTO needs. And then you get the added security of tape-based data should all other sources fail, and also the ability to go back for longer-term archive as well. And it does provide a very strong flexibility on-premise, remote site, or cloud. You don't have to think of you have to pick one technology over the other. A smart man would say, well, actually, wouldn't you be better using different approaches and considering all backup technologies in terms of backup targets? And if you're using the right data protection solution, you can design a solution that maybe does quarterly copies off the tape and replicates up to the Azure cloud or the Amazon cloud or whatever at the same time. You don't need to use one or the other. You can actually use an intelligent combination of all these different sources. So as I've mentioned already, a sensible long-term retention strategy may be involved using tape as the most economical, cost-effective, cost per gigabyte form of medium. So if it is, let's embrace tape, and use it as a long-term retention for large volumes of data. It makes sense. Keep daily and weekly backups on disk and replicate to second sites. So from a DR and a day-to-day recovery, you've got all that capability on disk to manage. Keep month-end or quarterly backups on tape and hold off-site for 5 years or more. And we're still seeing lots of customers, certainly in the public sector, that have recognized this and said, yes, we could send data off to the cloud, but when we look at the cost of keeping 10 years plus backups in Azure or whatever, it starts to become quite expensive. And also a lot of organizations are worried about where their data ends up. Are they guaranteed that if they send it to Azure or Amazon, is the data going to stay within the EU, or is it going to be replicated to San Francisco or somewhere else that they can't control? So there's all these other challenges as well around data, safeguarding the data and where it's held within what borders as well. So the key benefits of using a kind of sensible long-term approach of combining disk and tape is that it eliminates power, cooling, and maintenance costs. It doesn't really make sense to keep 10 years worth of monthly recovery points on disk because you're having to keep spinning disk cooled, it needs power, and even with all the latest RAID and power down technology, there still is a cost associated, a running cost associated with keeping data online. So you can reduce that significantly. If that data is only going to be ever used for an occasional compliance restore, does it make sense to have it spinning on disk? Provide protection from a disaster. I think we've seen with Google and other large organizations, tape is the belt and braces approach. It gives you that last level of defense. If all else fails, having a periodic copy of the data on tape can be a very good ally, and it could protect organizations' integrity. Long-term retention for compliance, as we've already mentioned, tape is a perfect platform for keeping data for long-term. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Arcserve and what we do. Arcserve is a global company. We used to be a part of a larger enterprise software company called CA Technologies, but we separated from CA in August, September 2014 time. And since then, we've run as an independent software company. One thing that's great is that in the last 2 years, our business has grown significantly. In the last 12 months alone, globally, we've grown at 29% year on year as a business. In the UK, we've grown at over 40% year on year. We have about 45,000 customers at the moment under active maintenance. So obviously, we have thousands more customers probably using our software outside of maintenance, but in terms of registered maintenance customers, that's what we have. Our new generation backup technology, UDP, Unified Data Protection, we have over 22,000 customers, so nearly half our customer base is using our new platform. We have about 7,500 transacting partners, and we do business in over 150 countries around the world. Our EMEA European headquarters is in Barcelona, but we do obviously have our global HQ in the US and in Minneapolis, and we have other regional headquarters around the world as well. In recent times, we've won significant accolades from VMworld and VMware, where we won Best of Show and Best Virtualization for DR Project awards. We also won awards in VMworld in the US. We won a gold award for Best Disaster Recovery and Backup for Virtualized Environments, and we won other key accolades as well. So as a company, we are moving fast. It's exciting times at Arcserve right now. We're just about to launch a brand new release of UDP as well, our Unified Data Protection, and our traditional Arcserve tape technology. We're on release 17 at the moment, and we're going to be bringing out 17.5 next month as well. So it's exciting times. Now, I'm going to talk about our strategy as a company because obviously, you know, our sweet spot or our focus area is what we call the mid-enterprise or the mid-market. And, you know, we believe we've got probably the broadest range of technology to allow customers to design an enterprise-class data protection solution, but at a price point that they can afford, and providing very reliable and simple-to-use interfaces that make our solutions to be used by the generalists rather than the dedicated backup IT professional that all he does every day of the year is manage data protection. What we find is we're selling into IT departments that have got 3 or 4 good technical guys. One day they're doing networking, the next day they're doing desktop management and antivirus, the next day they're provisioning VMs and managing storage, and they're also in charge of backups and data protection. So they need technology that's easy to use, something that's intuitive, something that's reliable. They set the policy and it just works. So we've designed a solution with unified data protection to have a solution that's very optimized for virtual infrastructure, because let's face it, probably 75–80% of most IT infrastructure now is virtualized. However, what we've also seen is that a significant chunk of those customers still have a lot of physical infrastructure as well. And the challenge is that, you know, these companies tend to have multiple backup products, which makes the whole data protection really difficult to manage. So they may go out and buy a niche virtual backup product to protect their virtual infrastructure, but then they end up using an old or a different backup product to back up their physical environment. These technologies don't really work with each other. I was visiting a customer last week, and they basically move all their Veeam backups off to tape managed by HP Data Protector. And, you know, I said to them, okay, well, what happens if you need to restore an individual file from a backup taken 2 years ago? And the guy just looked at me because he realized there isn't really a good way to do that, because there's no catalog that gets migrated from Veeam off to their HP solution. And even if they were using Veeam's tape technology, it would do a raw backup to disk, which would require you to dump it back from tape to disk and then do the granular research through the disk-based backup product. So it's a very convoluted process. For example, when we do a disk-to-tape migration, we migrate the catalog onto tape. And if you need to restore a file that's 2.5, 3, 5 years old, you can search for the individual file. It will tell you what media it's on, and you can recover that straight away. Straight from tape. You don't even have to stage it back to disk first. So it's when you actually analyze these processes, you realize that some customers have big claims about what they can do with disk tape, but when it comes down to it, it's a very convoluted recovery process. So we've got predominantly a disk-based backup and recovery solution now, but the key thing about UDP, it provides different ways to migrate the data to lower costs of storage. So you can migrate it off to tape, and Arcserve has over 25 years experience managing tape libraries. So we supported just about every industry tape library that's on the market, you know, Storage Tech, Quantum, Spectralogic, and all the OEM variants that come out from Dell and HP as well, and IBM. So we've got a lot of tape library support. We can manage tape encryption, tape compression, barcode scanning, autoloaders, tape library units, robotics, etc. We've also started to develop hardware snapshot integration as well with DDP, so we can take snapshots at the hypervisor and offload those onto the SAN. So we now integrate with NetApp using FlexClone technology. We've just recently certified Nimble storage, and HP FreePAR is getting launched as well in the next release of the product next month. So we're expanding our hardware integrated snapshot capabilities as well. And we've also got a solution that's cloud ready. It will basically back up workloads in the cloud, but it will also use cloud as a disaster recovery platform as well, where you may want to do disk to cloud instead of disk to tape, etc. So we give a lot of choices on how you can plan that. So in the next slide, I'm just going to kind of explain a bit, if you took a typical customer's environment, what it would kind of look like being managed by Arcserve. So if you take your data center, for example, we would deploy a server into that environment, which we call a recovery point server. The RPS is a deduped repository on disk, essentially, and it can be provided in two ways. It can be a software deployed solution, where you provide a high-spec server and direct attached storage, typically, and we install our software onto it and turn it into a dedupe appliance. Or we can actually ship an all-in-one appliance unit now. So Arcserve sells hardware. That's unbelievable. We've been doing that now for over 18 months. And these units are well-spec'd servers. They've got nearline SAS disks. They've got solid-state disk for the dedupe indexes. And we can put all sorts of connectivity in the back of these boxes. We can add tape library units to do disk to tape. We can add fiber channel to do LAN-free backups of your VMware environment, for example. We can put 10 gigabit Ethernet as well as additional gigabit ports on these machines as well. So our appliances are well-spec'd, scalable units where you can expand the capacity over time as well. And they have all the licensing built into the cost of the appliance as well. So it doesn't matter if you're using an appliance or a software deployed RPS server, the functionality is exactly the same. We do source-side global dedupe of all the backup sets. So when we're backing up virtual machines, it's all completely agentless, where we do integrate with a hypervisor through VMware and Hyper-V. So if you've got Hyper-V or VMware in your environment, we don't need to deploy agents into the VMs. And then all the physical servers, or if you're using things like KVM or Citrix Zen or other hypervisors, we can basically put agents on the VMs and back them up as well. So once we back up to disk, we only send the unique blocks from the source, and at the back end we're doing global inline target-based dedupe, where we're basically referencing all the data globally and only backing up unique blocks from each system. So we compress and dedupe at the same time and significantly reduce the amount of data that we can hold on disk. And this is what I was saying about earlier, that when you think about disk to tape, now all of a sudden you've got a disk repository that can hold months worth of recovery points, whereas your current setup, you may only be able to hold days or possibly weeks worth of recovery points. So that gives you a lot more flexibility on the frequency that you may want to offload to tape. And you can see in this diagram here, we can migrate off to tape for long-term archive as well. Now, as you start to deploy the solution out, it could be that you've got other remote sites and branch offices. Depends on the size of the branch offices. It could be that you've got a small site where you just stick an agent or a proxy on that site to back up physical or virtual machines, and the data can be sent straight to the central site over the network. But if you have a lot of data, we can drop in a smaller appliance or even a virtual recovery point server, which we can build on a Windows VM and stage the backups locally and compress and dedupe. Now, if we have multiple recovery point servers or appliances, these servers have integrated replication, and we use dedupe around the replication to replicate recovery points between the data stores. So we're very efficient in sending data off-site, and that could be from a remote branch office to your head office, or your head office to a disaster recovery site. Now, once we get the data to the DR site, we have a whole automation layer around provisioning. So we have a technology called virtual standby that allows you to create virtual clones from the backups. And these virtual clones can be spun up in a few minutes. You don't need to do a VM level restore or a bare metal recovery of the physical server. We can spin it up as a VM clone from the last recovery point in a few minutes. And in version 6 of UDP, which we launched this year, we've got a new provisioning technology which we call Instant VM Restore, which allows you to provision directly from the backup image on disk. So you don't even have to create a clone ahead of time now. You can actually spin it up straight from this backup storage. And then if you want to keep it running as a VM, you can use vMotion or move the storage in Hyper-V to a permanent location on disk. So it allows you to provision very quickly, and you can actually allow users to access the system straight away and migrate the data in the background even whilst the system's online. So it's very clever, and it's all about reducing that recovery time objective. But with the disk-based technology as it works, we can also back up very frequently as well. We put in high-frequency plans on disk to minimize data loss to give you a much improved recovery point objective as well. Now, as you start to deploy the solution out, you may also want to incorporate cloud. Cloud is becoming really popular now, where organizations are really starting to embrace cloud and practically looking at the costs of managing their own DR facility versus actually pumping the data into a cloud, which is managed by somebody else. So then instead of having this CapEx expenditure that you have to deploy, more virtual hosts, more SAN shared storage in your DR infrastructure, paying for hypervisor licenses and operating system licenses, a lot of customers have sort of seen the light and said, hang on a minute, we've been doing this for the last 20 years. Every 4 or 5 years, we have to refresh hardware that we hardly ever use because it's purely there for DR. And what organizations are starting to say, instead of having to pay lots of OPEX costs around moving tapes, every day, not just quarterly and monthly, which we recommend, they're starting to say, let's use cloud, use that cost to pay for cloud storage, and their solution then becomes a lot more automated. But as I said at the start of this presentation, I still believe tape has an interesting fundamental part to play. And as you can see in this diagram, tape can still be part of an overall encompassing DR strategy where you may have multiple copies on disk, you may even have a copy in the cloud, but for long-term archive, your cloud may, for example, hold 2 years worth of recovery points, but on tape you may hold it for 10 years. So the idea is short-term recoveries off disk, your medium-term recoveries from cloud, and your long-term recoveries from tape. So you can encompass all of these technologies into a cohesive data protection strategy. The key thing about all of this is it's managed from a simple to use web-based console that's very intuitive. So in summary, I don't believe tape is dead at all. I think the role of tape has significantly changed, and a lot of that has been lost in translation where customers say, oh, tape is old technology, we want to get rid of that. It's just impractical, it's unreliable, takes up a lot of our time, we just want to get rid of tape. But I think a cleverer person would actually take a couple of steps back and say, hang on a minute, if you look at tape and how it's evolving in terms of the capacity and the performance and the reliability, tape still serves a very interesting purpose for organizations. It's just the way it's used needs to change. And by using an intelligent combination of disk, cloud, and tape, you can actually have the best of all worlds and keeping the overall cost of the solution to a manageable level. And that's really important as well. So the role of tape has changed for most customers. It's doing periodic copies to tape for compliance, not for primary backup destination, that's disk, but for compliance where you need to hold years worth of recovery points in tape, just in case you need to go back 5, 10 years or longer. It makes a lot of sense. Allows you to lower the tape management and DR costs, but still retain backup sets for a long period of time. Tape is ideal for customers that have low bandwidth WAN environments. That yes, in a perfect world, if you had gigabit links between your data centers and hundreds of megabit pipes between your remote branch offices, then everything could be automated. and we have full functionality to do all that remote site replication and management to eliminate tape. But for some organizations, they don't have that luxury. So tape still can provide a practical alternative to do things like disk-to-disk to tape in your data center. Tape drives and falling media costs are attractive now. You know, every time we bring out a new LTO drive, the cost of the gigabyte falls because of the capacity and the performance that each iteration of LTO brings to the table, but also the media cost for previous versions drops significantly. So now LTO 7 is on the market, you suddenly find that the cost of an LTO 6 tape drops significantly because it's no longer the new toy on the shelf. It's, you know, the new toy is the LTO 7, so then the media for LTO 6 drops and 5 becomes even cheaper again. So sometimes it's more cost effective to have the iteration before the latest one to keep the cost of media low as well. So it's working out all of that, but I still think it represents a significant saving for long-term archive. So what's next? Okay, I've kind of banged on about tape. We at Arcserve believe tape still has a pivotal role to play in a lot of organizations. It's not going to be the right fit for everybody, I admit that and accept that, but I think it's only because sometimes tape is dismissed because of the way it used to be used, and people haven't considered it being used in a different way. So what's next? Okay, well, if you go to the Arcserve website, I put the link there to the UK page, but if you go to arcserve.com, if you're contacting us outside of the UK, it's language orientated. So if you're connecting in from Spain, it will take you to a Spanish site. If you're connecting in from Italy or France, it will take you to the relevant local country site or Germany. So the information will be there in your language. There's loads of information available, data sheets, white papers, information on the products, the solutions that we sell. There's also lots of exciting case studies, you know, where we've implemented Arcserve over the last 12, 18 months, and we've actually got, you know, really complimentary statements from large organizations who have invested and trusted in Arcserve and, you know, seen the sort of the benefits and the return on investment by using our technology. You can also try our technology for free. We have a full trial copy that's available, 30-day, no strings attached eval copy, where you get unlimited access to all of the products in UDP, you know, and there's no strings attached. You just need to register and download. There's also a whole host of information on YouTube. I do encourage you to have a look at that. We tend to post all our videos, webinars, presentations, even practical things like how do we do an instant VM restore, how do we do a bare metal restore of a physical server onto alternative hardware, how do we integrate with the cloud. There's some great topics on YouTube available as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open it up for questions. We do have a question panel in GoToWebinar. So I do encourage you, you know, if you really want to ask a question on the audio, I'm not going to stop you. I'm going to be on the phone. But if you just want to ask a question and get an answer, we do have a questions panel in the GoToWebinar software. I'll be reviewing the questions now. So if you've got any questions that you would like to ask, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes reviewing the questions panel and answering any questions that's being raised. So I hope I've made you think this morning. I really don't want to sort of try and brainwash people, but even if you just take a backward step and say, actually, what he's saying does make a bit of sense. I could see us, you know, holding certain data sets for a longer period of time. So that tape library that we're planning to get rid of, you know, may actually have a purpose if you look at the bigger picture and design your data protection strategy in the right way. So I just want to thank you again. My name's Charlie Smith. I've enjoyed presenting to you this morning. I hope you've enjoyed the session as well. We tend to run these webinars every few months or sometimes more frequently than that. So watch out for the next one, and I'll look forward to speaking to you then. Thank you very much.